Hello and welcome to AmericanNavalHistory.com. My name is John Sorensen and I am putting together a set of presentations to teach the history of the United States Navy. In this lesson I would like to first set the scene of post-revolutionary America. We need to understand the situation that America was in before there was a Navy to fully understand why they decided to invest the big money that it required to build a Navy. There was opposition to the creation of a Navy and good congressional debates over its authorization. Understanding these debates will help us fully understand the reasons and the purpose for the United States Navy. Following the American Revolutionary War, the ex-colonies formed a loose confederation under an agreement called the Articles of Confederation. This was, like I said, a very loose organizational treaty. Each state was supreme. Each state was sovereign unto itself. There were many problems with this loose confederation. Most of the problems were caused by the weakness of the unity between the states. The government did not have the power or the authority to tax the citizens or even the states. The state legislatures sent representatives to Congress. The representatives represented the state, not the citizens in the states. Farmers in Massachusetts were being forced off their farmland, and they had a violent rebellion against the government, and this became known as Shays' Rebellion. And at one point, Connecticut and New Jersey almost went to war against the state of New York. Very similar thing happened down in Maryland and Virginia. Almost got into a war over the fishing rights and oyster fishers down on the banks of the Potomac River. And their settlement could not be enacted because the Articles of Confederation stated that no two states could make a treaty within themselves without the majority of the other states agreeing to it. And a lot of the other states had reasons not to want the navigational agreements between Maryland and Virginia to be passed, so they all voted against it. And there were a lot of problems with these Articles of Confederation, and they decided, hey, let's get together and we need to strengthen these. And that's when we had the Constitutional Convention. But before we get to talking about the Constitutional Convention, I'm not even going to cover it here in this lesson, just to say that they had it. We'd like to talk about some of the maritime problems at sea in America after the Revolution and before the Constitution. There's what they call the Confederation period. American merchant ships were making great profit in trade all around the world, but their ships were no longer being protected by the British Navy. We had to protect them with our Continental Navy, but the Confederation was very cash poor. We did not have enough money, so what the Congress ended up doing was selling off the Continental Navy because it just could not afford to maintain these ships or even pay the crews. I think I said in the previous lesson that the maintenance on these wooden ships in the salt water was very high and very expensive to keep a ship up in those days. So in June 1785, the Continental Navy sold its last ship, the Alliance, and the Navy was disbanded. Captain John Barry was the Alliance's commanding officer, and he was discharged into civilian life. So not only were our merchants not being protected anymore by the British Navy, but now they were not even being protected from the Continental Navy any longer either. And in 1783, the British issued the orders to the Council, which prohibited the British ships from the British West Indies from trading with American ships. And then, all of a sudden, after they stopped trading with us, the British West Indies suddenly ran out of food, and the West Indies had a high population of slaves down there in the West Indies, and all of a sudden they couldn't feed them. So the British government they didn't rescind the orders to the Council, but what they did was they just kind of looked the other way, and the American smugglers could go in there and we could make a profit off of trading our food with the British in the West Indies. But then, after they started up another war with France in 1793, they issued a new orders to the council, and when that was issued, any ships caught trading with the French or any French possession could be stopped or captured at sea. And at the same time, 1793, the French issued a very similar policy, and they allowed privateers to capture any American ship trading with Great Britain. So the French policy stated that any ship laden in part or in whole with British goods was declared to be a good prize, and this was purposely written to allow the French to capture American ships. And one French politician is quoted as saying, if even a handkerchief of English origin was found aboard a neutral vessel, the rest of the cargo and the whole ship itself could be subject to condemnation. So the British stopped all American ships because they didn't want them to be trading with the French, and the French stopped all the American ships because they didn't want them to be trading with the British. And the American merchant ships, they had no navy to protect them. Now, we need to pay close attention here, and this is probably going to be one of the most boring slides of the presentation, but it's also one of the most important too, so try to pay close attention to it. A national debate over the adoption of the Constitution arose over the power and the relationship between the states and the federal government and the state governments. A group that was referred to as the Federalists were in favor of a strong federal government that had power that was superior to that of the state governments. The Federalists were mostly a group of men from the northern New England states led by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and John Adams. They supported funding a strong standing Navy to protect the merchant shipping and the garrisons that protect the Navy docks. Now there's another group called the Anti-Federalists, and they were afraid of giving too much power to a central government. They felt that could lead to the same type of tyranny that they had just fought a terrible war against to be liberated from, like the British. Okay. The Anti-Federalists supported strong state governments over the federal government. The Anti-Federalists were mostly from the southern and middle states, and they were led by Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. You know, their opposition to a standing navy was based upon the cost. And that was quite different from the opposition they had about a standing army, that the standing army the cost was not the concern, but they were afraid of having an army that had the power to tax people, and they feared the tyranny of an army. They didn't fear the tyranny of a navy, but they feared the cost of a navy. So the Anti-Federalists, they did not wish for the federal government to have the power to tax the people, and that is mostly why they opposed having a navy, because if they had a navy, then for sure the government would have to tax the people to support it. Well, here I'm going to skip one of the most important and interesting chapters of American history, the Constitutional Convention. For the context of today's talk, I will just say that the Americans realized that the Articles of Confederation were not working. Each state, except for Rhode Island, sent representatives to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787, and there they wrote the Constitution, which was ratified in 1788. The Constitution provided the country with a much stronger central government structure, more unity of the states. The government was given the power to raise revenues by taxing the people. It also gave the Congress the power to provide and maintain a navy. Now, I did not say that Congress had to provide and maintain a navy, only that it had the power to do so. In 1788, Congress did not have the money to build a navy, and many of the people in Congress did not want to build a navy even if they did have the money. So, the pre-constitutional debate over a standing army was intense. the Anti-Federalists feared that a standing army would always pose a threat against the American people. They feared the oppression that an army that a government could have if they had a standing army. Americans had good reason for this fear, to fear a powerful ruler with the right to tax and a standing army to assist or to enforce the taxation. That they had just fought a war against that, and it was an honest fear that they had against having a standing army living in and amongst them. Okay, they had just fought a war against the British, and they saw that a strong federal army as putting themselves right back into the same position they just fought their way out of, and they did not want to set that situation back up again. So the arguments against a standing navy were quite different from those arguments against a standing army. A standing navy was expensive to set up and maintain. They did not fear oppression from a navy, but they feared the taxes that it would require to build a navy, and maybe oppression from the government to raise those taxes. Okay, so So building and maintaining the fleet would be a very expensive endeavor, and the Anti-Federalists who opposed the standing navy mostly argued over having to tax the citizens to support it. The government with too much power to tax the people could become too oppressive. And regionalism also played a part into this debate, because Thomas Jefferson, being a Southerner, he argued why should the people of the southern states be forced to pay for a navy that was basically being used to protect the merchant trade, and that was all to the benefit of the Northeasterners, and he didn't see why the people in the southern states should be forced, that part of their tax money should go to support that. So although the Constitution allowed Congress to build the Navy, Congress debated whether to actually build the Navy. They had the authority to, but they didn't actually decide, and as they debated it, they made no decision. And when you decide to build something, no decision is a no decision. And so the Navy was not authorized by Congress. Now, 1793 was an important year. When 1793 started and when it ended, the United States had no Navy. It was in 1793 that another war between Great Britain and France broke out, and the British reissued their orders to the Council, and the French began taking American merchant ships at sea. Both sides were suspicious that our merchant traders were trading with the other side, and neither side respected our neutrality, and the American merchant ships were defenseless without a navy to protect them. Also, in 1793, the war between Algiers and Portugal ended. The Portuguese Navy no longer kept the Barbary pirates bottled up in the Mediterranean Sea. So now the Barbary pirates were free to harass our merchant ships in the Atlantic Ocean as well as in the Mediterranean. And again, we had no navy to protect our merchant fleets. And it was in 1793 that Congress began to seriously debate funding for a navy. Congress began debating the establishment of a navy in late 1793. The Barbary pirates were the main force behind the urgency of this action, although the French were also of some concern. During the debate, President George Washington kept trying to reach a reasonable agreement with the Barbary states, but the negotiations were unsuccessful. The Barbary states had nothing to fear if we had no navy. And President Washington addressed Congress in support of a navy on December 3rd, 1793, saying, and I love this quote, "If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire peace, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war." They're one of my favorite quotes. It was also about this same time that the British government issued their new and more stringent order to the Council, because they started their war with France. And the Barbary pirates were holding our ships hostage and making raids in the Atlantic Ocean as well as in the Mediterranean. and both the French and the British were ignoring the Neutrality Act. And you would think that passage of the Navy Act would have been a no-brainer, would have been almost automatic with all these problems going on at sea. But there were those in Congress who opposed it, and those opposing it, you know, they had these, basically they had four really decent arguments. And the first was paying tributes to the pirates would be cheaper than constructing a navy. The second was, hey, why don't we just hire the Portuguese Navy to protect American ships at sea? And the third was an argument that if you give this much control to Congress to spend such large amounts of money to decide where the ships would be built, then that would lead to corruption in the Admiralty, like the British had, and like we have today. And the fourth argument was that 6 frigates would be insufficient to protect our merchant fleet around the world, and 6 frigates would lead to more. So if you're going to have the Navy be the solution, you're going to have a much bigger Navy than that, and where would it stop? So, but, you know, even with those arguments in Congress, the Navy Act did pass and was signed into law in March of 1794. And this law provided for funding for the construction of 6 frigates to be placed under the control of the War Department. And it also reestablished the United States Marine Corps. Although the Marine Corps still uses the birth date of their Continental Marine Corps of November 10th, 1775 as their official birthday, but the final passage of the Navy Act did reestablish them. And this act also provided for the building of the 6 frigates to be built in 6 different states, so that they could secure the votes in Congress of all of those delegates. Okay. Once the constitutional debate was over, Thomas Jefferson was able to accept the concept of federalism. Although he had opposed the congressional power to establish a navy in the 1780s, in the 1790s he favored having a navy to protect U.S. ships at sea. And because of the difficulty of procuring large ships for the Navy, desire for greater firepower, the 6 frigates were built with a very loose definition of the term frigate. These frigates were designed and constructed by Joshua Humphreys to be as long as ships of the line, so you could fit as many cannons on them as you could on a ship of the line, but they were narrower at the beam, and this would provide for greater firepower and greater speed than most of the frigates of that time had. And the ships were specifically built and designed to be able to outrun and outfire the ships of the Barbary pirates. So let's take a look at what effect that this Navy Act of 1794 had. Immediately after the signing and the passage of this act, the United States was able to sign the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, and Great Britain recognized American neutrality in their war with France. The United States also sought a similar treaty with France to end the French practice of capturing American ships at sea, because in 1798 the French Navy ships captured more than 300 American merchant ships at sea. So the post-revolutionary government of France refused all diplomatic contact with the United States government. Remember that the French were not only having an on-again, off-again war with Great Britain, but they were also coming off of their own French Revolution at the time too. Because they kept capturing our ships, we got into what they call the quasi-war, and we fought that war mostly at sea with France from 1798 to 1800. And this was a Navy war for 2 years. And when the war ended, the United States Navy had captured 80 French warships. And after that, the French pretty much agreed to stop capturing American merchant ships at sea. They knew they learned their lesson well, and the United States had earned the respect of the world. And about halfway through the construction of the first frigates, the Barbary states suddenly began to negotiate more reasonably with the United States, and they reached an agreement in 1796. And we agreed to pay a small tribute payment to them, and every year we sent a frigate to make that payment. And in 1801, the United States frigate went to Algiers to pay the annual tribute. And while they were there in Algiers, the fort's guns threatened, down upon the frigate that was in port. They threatened, and they captured the ship and the crew. And a 4-year war broke out between the United States and the Barbary pirates and the Barbary states to settle the matter. And at the end of that, no more tribute payments were made. The United States gained a huge amount of respect throughout all of Europe when the United States Marine Corps raised the American flag in Tripoli in 1805. So within 12 years of its founding, the United States had defeated the French and the Barbary states to establish its right to travel freely on the high seas, not to mention the respect of the entire world. That is where I need to end this for now. I do plan on covering the quasi-war with France and the Barbary pirates in 2 separate lessons in the future. But right now I just had to cover enough of them to demonstrate the immediate impact and the value of the United States Navy had on the world almost from the date of its very inception. So, my name is John Sorensen, and thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com.